an architecture media podcast supported by the Australian Institute of Architects, produced on Boon Wurrung country.
Welcome to Design Speaks Weekly, a podcast that explores the biggest stories in Australian architecture and design. I'm your host, Georgia Burks, and today I'm joined by Kevin O'Brien, a Brisbane-based architect of Kaurereg and Meriam heritage and a principal at BVN Architecture. We talk about the variety and evolution of his work over a career that spans more than 30 years, and Kevin considers what's next for Indigeneity in architecture. But first, here's the latest news headlines from Architecture AU.
The New South Wales Government has yesterday launched 9 new mid-rise apartment building designs for their housing pattern book, adding to 8 low-rise designs that were released earlier this year. With the aim to meet a growing demand for compact living in well-located areas, the mid-rise patterns are able to be assessed by councils in half the average time and are currently available at a subsidised cost. In Western Australia, 10 train station precincts have been prioritised for the development of high-density housing via streamlined approval pathways. The reforms establish the state government as the responsible body for density controls and decision-making within these precincts, as part of their plan to boost urban infill and hone a consistent approach. Those are the headlines for this week. For the full stories and more news, visit architectureau.com. I'm Lucia Amies. It's Tuesday, November 25.
Over the past 3 decades, architect Kevin O'Brien has worked across numerous projects and typologies in architecture and the arts, notably the exhibition design for Kith and Kin, Archie Moore's exhibition for the 2024 Venice Biennale, and the first Australian work to win the prestigious Golden Lion. With his many accolades and appointments, Kevin has become a mentor for young First Nations graduates and architects and a leader in designing with country approaches. Finally, we are witnessing a broader swathe of built projects that champion Indigenous collaborations, histories and knowledge. At last week's Design Speaks symposium in Melbourne, we focused on this progress of Indigeneity in architecture, learning that although things have changed in the last 30 years, there is still a long way to go, and education is key to this shift. To continue this conversation today, we sat down with Kev to reflect on the evolution of his work over his storied career and discuss what the growing number of Indigenous architects means for the profession. Hello, Kevin, and welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Georgia. It's great to be here.
It's great to have you here. Kev, let's go back to the 90s. From 1990 to 1995, you undertook your Bachelor of Architecture at the University of Queensland. And in 1993, you had a year out of university at the Australian Construction Services, which led to one of your first projects in Warrabinda, Queensland. Can you tell us more about this project? What led you to it and what did you learn?
Yeah, so in 1993, I had my year out working for Australian Construction Services, which was the former, well, previously it was the Federal Public Works. And I'd won a scholarship to work there for a year, which we had to do back in those days as after our third year at university. And I was looked after by a guy called John Greeley, who went on to be a director of Architectus and quite a few other big practices. Fantastic architect who's now retired, but he sort of took me under his wing a bit. And as a third year student, in those days we were sort of just starting to learn how to do some things on the computer, but we're still hand drawing a lot of things. So typically as a student you'll be hand drawing the smaller bits and pieces and markups. And this project's come through for Warrabinda, which is kind of inland from Rockhampton. It's got a pretty interesting history, and it's a small mission setup. And there was, the request was for a small mini town mall of sorts. And he said he knew my background, and in a really supportive way. It wasn't in any way paternal. He said, you should have a go at this. What do you think? I said, sure. And so we had a couple of meetings with some of the locals back then. And it was very simple. It's like just a strip sort of mall that was some hard surfaces that work with some existing landscaping and some extra shade structures. And there were these big sort of curving bench seats that formed and held the landscape and provided places for people to sit together, light fires, but also be in the shade because it's quite a hot part of the world. And I think I got demolished about 2013, 14 when I went back out there to do another project, 20 years later, and I'd totally forgotten about it, but it was incredible to go back out and see it and go, oh my God, that was there and it was still being used. And it was, anyway.
It stood the test of time.
Yeah, it did, yeah. So it was a really nice sort of thing to see, but also my first interaction with other First Nations people that weren't family. That was the big thing. And you absolutely, because we obviously share First Nations heritages, just because you're accepted in one group, that doesn't mean anything in another group, and wherever you go around the countries. So
lots of different personalities, perspectives, opinions, everything, laws. Yeah. I guess, was that one of the biggest lessons through that project, that first project?
Yeah, I think so. And I think the thing I've learnt, and touch wood, it's only happened to me once, where we didn't get a good start on a project, but typically people are reasonably authentic. And if you're authentic and genuine, that tends to convey, and that sort of sets the basis of developing trust, and then you can kind of get into the work and the project. I can remember one example where we didn't, but that was mainly because we were part of someone else's baggage, so that was a bit tricky, that one. But
yeah, authenticity is such an important thing, I think, particularly in this day and age.
Yes, yeah.
Look, Kev, you also then, after that, you went on to deliver a number of built and unbuilt projects, including residential, theatre sets, schools, hospitals, and frameworks. And I know you have a few current projects in the works right now, but I'd like to hear about the one that has most recently been completed. Can you share with us your most recent project, and even if they differ in typology, are there any similarities between your latest project and the first one you just spoke about?
Well, funnily enough, the one project that has practically finished, we're expecting the PC certificate any minute, which I haven't spoken to anyone really about, is the new ATO offices in Canberra. And that has been working, that's been in the office, I should say, for almost 8 years, and started with a gang of guys I used to work with together in former days at Donovan Hill. Then they worked with me. Another very good friend of mine, James Duplessis, was leading the first half of the project. It's a big building. It's a monster. It's 30,000 square metres, but it's only 6 stories high, so that's 5,000 square metres per floor plate. Big atrium space in the middle, and the big move in it was to pull all the sort of meeting rooms into and consolidate them into a tower that then sits in the atrium. So you have this kind of, tower that activates a central atrium that's floodlit from above. And now that's a really interesting building because it's a spec commercial building in a way, but there's certain parts of it that, in the way every architect brings their sort of cultural view to bear on a project, and it gets embedded just because of who you are. There's these little things that we were calling oriels, that they're little glass boxes. Well, they start as glass boxes, and they just push beyond the facade line. And when you're in them, it's just a small intimate space that puts you outside the typical floor plate. It also, we position them so that they looked at very specific viewing points in Ngunnawal country around Canberra. So they would, they'd look at that mountain or that hill or whatever it was when we started to do all that initial research. And it's just a subtle thing. And yeah, really excited about that sort of finishing shortly. So they're just about to, I think they have this week's started to put in the minor fit out that's being done by others, but the main base work is pretty much done. So
that's exciting. And comparing that first project you spoke about, which was a little shade structure with a place for gathering, to your latest project, which is this 30,000 square metre building with these glass boxes, which also create a little place for gathering. Would you say that these sort of human scale details are the similarities between the two projects?
I think you've nailed it. That's exactly it. Because in the end, I think because of, again, the heritage you and I shared, that the thing we always want to have some connection to is that bit of country wherever you are, and whatever that takes in terms of, it can be just a room that puts you into a view, in some kind of experience with it, before any narrative is overlaid across the thing. And there's a role I think architecture has just to get things right in terms of how you not manipulate, but how you deliberately pull people together and put them in a relationship with country, just to it's something you feel as opposed to read.
Exactly. Actually, that's a really good segue to my next question, Kev, because you, speaking on country, just speaking about designing with country there, you continue to be a source of leadership for the next generation of architects and built environment professionals, particularly when it comes to designing with and for country. You encourage all architects, I would say, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, to learn the tools to lead in this approach. What would be your advice to those starting to learn this process? What tools would you point them to?
I think the first is to learn as much as possible about one's culture, and that to me goes for anyone, whether you're First Nations, European descent, New Australian, whatever it is. Like, hold on to that thing that is part of your identity. Understand it. Try and learn more about it, but not in a kind of superficial way, but in a way that you can learn from it, because there's stuff in that is what makes you important and makes your contribution in a collaborative sense really important. It makes genuine diversity in thinking possible when you can think about things. And so that, I think that's important to do, because it gives you a strength and a confidence. And I can, if I reflect back on the 90s when I was going through architecture, it that felt like a whole other world. And it wasn't until towards the end when I sort of liaised more with the First Nations unit out at UQ that the director sort of opened up the bigger question about what does your understanding of your culture mean in terms of what it is you're doing in architecture. It was the one question that had never been put. In fact, it was definitely not encouraged when I was there. So I think this next generation coming through, which is really exciting, are much stronger, much more confident, much more savvy. But they're just going to, take things even further, which is really exciting. Really exciting watching, the Manis and the Tianas and all this lot coming through. It's fantastic.
Yeah. And I think, though, Kev, it would be remiss not to say that is also, that growth of the next gen is due to your mentorship and guidance for all of us, and yourself, Dylan, Carol as well, in that whole arena. So it's exciting to see what's happening there. And Kev, look, also your approach to design is to improve the understanding between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians by designing spaces that connect with history, both ancient and modern, of the country of which these buildings are built. Speaking of this growth of what we're seeing in the industry now, and with more architecture practices considering culture, community and country in their design, how do you think the profession will change in the next decade or two because of this approach?
I think that there's, like all things, there's at least two roads, and people are going to have to decide which ones they go down. I think on one side there's a sort of a narrative-led commitment, and on the other side there's what I and the one I tend to lean more towards is this idea of understanding architecture as an articulation of space that puts people in relationship with country and culture in all manner of form. My problem with the narrative side is that it can be to me way too form driven, and it tends to end in things that are symbolic, that have meaning when it's written about, but when you get into the idea of architecture, which is it's a three-dimensional thing, it's a thing that has to be built, it's a thing that has to be articulated spatially, to how you make things, make relationships, understand how it works with climate, weather, all these sorts of things. There's only so far a narrative can take you, and and the more and more I sort of read about things, and hear this sort of, certainly out of some of our academies, the emphasis on the narrative, and I go, well, I'll look at who's pushing this. They're not the people that I sort of speak about architecture with. In fact, most of those people haven't completed or undertaken buildings. So there's a whole other group of people I talk about architecture with in absolute detail, and some of them have very contrasting views, but they have very clear arguments for how things go together, how you assemble, how you form, how they become part of the city, how they enable culture, and it's a very different kind of undertaking. And if I was to really be even give it more clarity, I think things that rely on a narrative tend to start with identity and the shape of something, and then that's it, and then they just deliver it. Where when I'm talking about architecture with all these other sorts of characters, there's all these things that you do. You research, you make moves based on the research. You understand the party, how something's organised and delivered. You have a very clear picture of how that extends into the experiences one goes through. As a consequence, you arrive at the identity of the building. So one has identity at the start, one has identity at the end, and I think the two diverging paths. And I think everyone's just going to have to make up their mind what kind of practice they are, because the problem in it is for particularly practices that are predominantly absent of people culturally attuned. The narrative one is a very, very easy sort of commercially viable pathway, and the more and more stuff I see, the more and more I'm disappointed.
Now, it'd be really interesting to see how that all unravels over the next decade. In the architectural education, you are taught to understand or research, as you say, the site and how the building could be positioned on site to maximise light, natural ventilation, all of that stuff. That gets brought into creating a good building, and then that's layered with, I guess, the complexities that of context as well. And I think it was all holistic thinking about country. And then that is the architect doing the role to create a building and then thinking about country as well, would you say?
Yeah, I probably got a slightly different view on it, because I was quizzed about this recently, and this is my experience, and I could be totally wrong, but the thing I've found over the last sort of 30 odd years is when we talk about country, that it's understood in two ways, and one is as an absolute cultural paradigm within itself, and which has gatekeepers and people who know about it and stories that are bound to it, and some are passed on, some aren't, some have been stopped, and the stories like the Seven Sisters, it goes from one side of the continent to the other, all with the information to exist, law, these sorts of things, deep culture. Then there's this other version, which is I think where a lot of us are riffing around because we're not using stories, we don't have permission to use those stories, but what we can do on behalf of country is try and look after it. And the making buildings that are simply making gestures to country, or trying to pick out totems in country and these sorts of things, that's entertaining, fine. But in terms of an actual contribution to a real contribution to country that we can all do as architects, irrespective of where you're from, is to make smarter buildings that draw less energy, perform better, and stop damaging country. Maintain it, fix it, rejuvenate it.
Fantastic message, and agreed. Kev, look, to end our episode at this moment in time, what is inspiring you?
Ooh, okay. Very quickly then, I think the two things. I'm going to do everything in pairs. So one is, like I said, this next generation of particularly younger women, First Nations younger women coming through in architecture. Yourself, Marnie, Tiana, Sarah Lynn Reese. It's so exciting watching all of you do amazing new things that we were just nowhere near that at the same age. So that's brilliant, and it's so fantastic to watch. The other thing though is all the old boys that I talk to still, and they're starting to pass away, unfortunately. So there's a couple of them. So one's Brian Donovan, obviously next Donovan Hill. One's a guy called Michael Markham in Melbourne there. Dr. David Stewart, who passed away in April in Tokyo, about 92, I think. And the other is Rui Thompson, who also passed away. It'll be 10 years ago in 2 weeks. But, today, right as of this moment, the guy I'm working with heavily, again, is obviously Brian Donovan. And, he's an incredible thinker, but he's also the full architect. He can think about it, he can theorise. He knows how buildings go together. He knows how to speak to clients. He knows how to get the buildings built and how to deliver them. So, he's part of obviously that incredible Donovan Hill legacy that spanned 2 decades with a whole other group of people. And, it was pleasing to see at least a little bit of that recognised in this year's gold medal selection. But we're missing the proper acknowledgement of that whole body of work. So hopefully one day that'll be corrected. But he's in this other state where he's producing this whole other body of work, and I've been lucky to be part of it. And it's in my view work to the stuff we used to work on back in the Donovan Hill days. So there's 20 years there. He's coming up to another 20 years in another place, and the body works is very substantial. So that's what inspires me today. We're about to go straight into another meeting to talk about something else. So that's great.
I will tell Brian that you've recommended him to be a guest on the podcast based off that answer. And for our listeners, I think we'll add some show notes about Rui Thompson's work, because if they haven't read about him and his contribution to architecture in Aotearoa, I think they should definitely look and have a read. Look, Kev, thank you so much for your time today. It is always a pleasure. I could always go on and speak with you for hours. So thank you again for joining me.
No problem. My pleasure.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode, which is supported by the Australian Institute of Architects. If you're enjoying this podcast, be sure to subscribe, share, or leave a rating. I'm Georgia Burks, and this has been Design Speaks Weekly. Design Speaks Weekly is produced on Boonwurrung country. We acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and culture.